dear friends, and welcome back to our highlights on the book Action and Reaction. We are now reviewing chapter 2 that's entitled The Instructor's Comments. Leo, this chapter opens up very lovingly, very kind. It starts out with Mentor Druso along with Andre Luiz. They go, and others, they go to this particular part of the Mansão Paz where Druso basically goes and has a fraternal conversation, a discussion, an enlightening, uplifting sort of mini talk with patients. And what's interesting is the way he depicts this opening scene. If we can imagine, he says that it's sort of like if you go to a hospital ward where it's filled with people who have physical deformities, or particular ones that are in their skin, it is quite a sight for anyone, even for those of us who are healthcare practitioners, to see that. It even creates in us sort of an angst. We hurt for them. So you can imagine this is the scene that they're walking into. And you see the love and the tenderness and the kindness that Mentor Druso starts out with.
It is certainly a two very interesting points.
And tell us what he starts out with saying.
Exactly. That he, at first, it gives me goosebumps because he could give continuation the way that Andre Luiz explains that he's going to continue to talk about courage. So previously, he was talking to these individuals, we can assume, about courage. And courage is something that we all need in our lives, right? And we can ask God for courage and patience, and that is something that we certainly will receive in our lives. And the other point that he also gives a beautiful example of is his humbleness towards these people. Even though these are difficult individuals who are in the Mansão Paz rehabilitating themselves, but he doesn't come imposing. He comes in an inviting tone to these individuals, saying, here, we're all brothers and sisters, again, trying to make our lives better, right?
Read for us, Leo, exactly what that first line that Druso says, because it's like he just pulls at our heartstrings right when he says that first line. And it's the first two lines, really.
Exactly.
First two lines. Read for us, please.
Brothers and sisters, we will continue our comments regarding courage. Please do not feel that I am separate from you by virtues that I do not possess. To speak well and easily is very often a thorny duty in our mouths, forcing us into meditation and discipline.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Three sentences there, by the way.
So he brings us, he already puts himself sort of, not at the same level necessarily, but he humbles himself to make those who are suffering feel more comfortable. And he himself, we learn later in the book, that he really has a lot of inner struggles as well. So he really does feel that way, that look, we are not separated by a ton of virtues. I am still just like you. I'm working on myself. So it's a beautiful thing, because then they don't feel like there's this huge gap between him and between him and the patients, which is a beautiful thing.
So much so that he, it's interesting that he, and we'll learn through this book as well, that he has the knowledge, but there is much more besides just having the knowledge. And one of the things that I would like to quote again, 2 more passages, so we get a little bit more what he's trying to say here when we go back to the idea of action, reaction, right? And responsibility. And he says, our actions weave wings of freedom or shackles of imprisonment for our victory or our losses. And then he continues, we owe our fate to no one but ourselves. Beautifully, he brings back this idea of action, reaction. We reap what we sow, and we are responsible. It's nobody else's fault that whatever it's going on in our lives, in our daily lives, if we can bring this to our daily lives, it's our fault. So we have now the ability to go ahead and make amendment. How do we make amendment in our lives with this? Because he also talks about the justice, the God's justice that never works without love.
Yes, it's beautiful because first he mentions that humbly, he says, look, I'm not so far from who you are, when he talks to the patients that are there at Mansão Paz. And when he mentions that, basically we reap what we sow. I mean, it's the truth. It's harsh sometimes, especially you figure you're looking at a group of spirits that have suffered because of their own poor decision making in their evolutionary path. But he also says something beautiful, that we also, and I'm going to quote, he says, although the wisdom of our Heavenly Father does not forego justice when judging us, the same justice is not displayed without love. If we are victims of ourselves, we are also beneficiaries of divine tolerance. which reveals the sanctuaries of life so that we may expiate and solve, restore, and hope. But more so importantly, we are beneficiaries. What is it to be a beneficiary? Many things, but one of which we can benefit from this divine tolerance. That yes, we reap what we sow. Yes, if we transgress the laws of God, but we also have this abundant love from God that we learn with the law of cause and effect. Yes, I'm going to reap what I sow, but guess what? If you decide to do better in your life, you also can attenuate or mitigate the debt that we owe, which we'll come and talk about later in different chapters and different stories, right, Leo?
And how is that done? Certainly, yes, but how is that done? Through reincarnation. If we are through this book, on page 23, we can actually go back to the top of page 23 and says reincarnation is a concession from the heavenly goodness, and we must take advantage of it for our indispensable redemption. So it's a beautiful thing that, again, God is applying justice, the law of justice on our lives, and through reincarnation, we're given the opportunity to, again, redeem ourselves, to be more love and kind, as he brings in the next couple other paragraphs.
Yeah, the paragraphs following that, for those of you who wish to, follow along, the one or two paragraphs following that basically tell us that we remain tied to the accomplices. Basically, people in past lives who we've committed wrong deeds with, we remain attracted to them. We find them again in our lives. But the beauty of that is that God says, look, yes, you are attracted back to those same people to fix the wrong errors that you've made in the past, but also it's for an opportunity, is what he says, to liquidate heavy debts and to, above all, sow new crops of love, dignity, understanding, and spiritual growth. Leo, and I love what Druso does, because he basically gives us a perfect tip. So, okay, so I encounter these people again in my life. Maybe they're the people at my own Spiritist center. Maybe they're the people at my job.
Work,
maybe they're at work. Maybe they're, in my own family. We know that this is true. We have many cases. So what do I do? How do I make things work? Well, he says that what we need to do is to make these people our friends by not feeling, because the initial feeling sometimes with enemies or people we don't like, we have that antipathy, is repulsion, or we feel like we don't even want to understand them. But Druso comes and says we should make an effort through sublimating our sentiments, working on our sentiments. Leo, there is a beautiful quote in the book Boa Nova by Jesus. It's an actual story, but I'm just going to quote one thing. The book is not yet in English, but if it were translated to English, it'd probably be called something like The Good News or Good News. And Jesus says something so poignant and so moving. For those of you who can go and read the book in Portuguese, it's not in English yet. Jesus says that the greatest chisel is goodwill, and there is no greater marble than that of sentiment. So what does that mean? That if we have a strong willpower and a desire to change anything really in our lives, but most importantly, they always bring us back to the sublimation of our sentiments, which means we need to learn about emotions. We need to educate our emotions, because it's not by knowledge alone do we change, Leo. And like you said, Druso, who has a lot of knowledge, but later on, we don't want to give away the story.
Exactly.
Later on, we'll learn that he has to educate himself at an emotional, moral level to become stronger and to go through a redemptive process.
And put it into practice.
Put it into practice.
Because we'll all be called to the moment of getting that chisel out and let's go ahead and work on that marble. But there are two, let's say, also takeaways that we can take as we go towards the end of this chapter, which are actually two beautiful cases that towards the end of the this talk or this meeting that he's having with the individuals there, that one lady approaches him and asks him, Dr. Druso, or Mentor Druso, whichever way we want to say it, when I will go back to live with my son. And she's in despair. She's trying to go back. And what happened, Kisha? Tells us what's happened in this case.
First, Druso really gives her a nice, kind, and loving lesson, he says to her, because she's very anguished about not being able to see her son. So he talks about this idea of love. And he says it to her because she says, how can love contract such an enormous debt? And she asks that because she loved her son tremendously. And I'm going to summarize what Druso says. He basically says, look, love sometimes gets distorted. And he says it's love misinterpreted, love that's misused. And we learn that throughout our reincarnatory processes and through our evolutionary pathway, we have these sentiments of love, but they get kind of, dirty. Earlier we spoke today, Leo, and you gave this analogy of the water. And we can say, I'm going to tell your analogy because it's a good one. You said that love is like water, right?
Pure water.
Pure water. So you put in a little bit of coloring. So you taint the water. It's still water, right, but now it's tainted water. So that's what happens to love. Love is pure and divine. But through our reincarnations, because we're not perfect, we taint it. Mm-hmm. So, and what's interesting is what Druso tells Andre Luiz and Hilario, the behind the scenes of who this woman is and what's her story. Leo, and you can bring that for us.
Right. The idea was that the way she raised her kid, the way she treated her kid, was not so well conducted, because then he enters into this idea that he's everything, that he owns the truth and he mistreated people.
She puts
and all
those
that.
ideas in his head.
Exactly. So now she's called, after when she receives the opportunity to reincarnate again, she will be called to reincarnate with him, but in a much more difficult situation where those difficulties of life will call her or will give her the ability to apply different thoughts or to regenerate herself along with her son as well. So it's a beautiful thing. Again, reincarnation giving us the opportunity to let's say, make that water pure again.
Yes, there you go. We like the image of the water. And what's also interesting, because if we can bring it to our everyday life, how is this story going to affect me who's living in the physical life? And we have children, so how does it affect us? So we know that this particular woman, she had, and we quote from Druso, she had excellent moral qualities, but she failed to put that into her son. She failed to educate him. Instead, she incited ego and pride, and this idea of being superior to others, and he wound up failing tremendously, and now she is feeling really bad. And we can read in chapter 14 of the Gospel According to Spiritism more about those types of cases and what happens. And St. Augustine really elaborates about honoring parents and stuff like that. But Leo, just to end, is the last case, which is an interesting, sort of semi kind of case. It's a young man that asks mentor Druso, how come since I'm discarnated, how come I don't automatically have all my memories back?
It's a beautiful take back for us that we can apply in our lives. Druso explains to this individual who is, let's say, going through the difficulties of guilt that he created in himself, that because of that, he's not able to remember naturally what has happened to him, the people that he
in previous life
right, worked or lived together. So in this chapter, we see again that not only we go through this forgetfulness of the past when we reincarnate, but depending on our state, an evolutionary state, on what we do in this lifetime or this reincarnation, when we discarnate, not naturally, we're not going to remember everything, depending how we are, morally speaking. We have to make sure that we do the best as we reincarnate, discarnate or lose this physical body, that we're in a state of mind, that we're tranquil, that we're not holding anything back against anybody or any situation, where we can then perhaps go back and say, yeah, I had these moments in my life, but again, I'm able to remember. So it's a beautiful case that we can go and study, and again, bringing this to our daily lives to secure us of a better future, definitely.
Leo, it's working on the emotions, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's working on our emotions. So that is one last highlight we leave with you for this book. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.
Thank you.